Welcome back, everybody. This is another episode of Conversations on Anarres. I am Joseph Orozco. I'm the co-director of the Anarres project, and I'm really excited today for our discussion. We are opening up a new series with talking with the artist Will Burrows about his art and some of the ways that he's been inspired by Star Trek, particularly Star Trek Deep Space Nine. To sort of get into this, to sort of understand Will's work, I think it's important to have a little bit of context in the Star Trek universe. So 2024 is a very important year in Star Trek lore. Not only is 2024 the year in which there's supposed to be Irish unification, as we see discussed in Star Trek The Next Generation. So there's a unification of Ireland at last. But for our purposes today, the last part of August 2024 is really momentous for the history of the Federation and for Starfleet in general, according to Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the two-part episode Past Tense 1 and 2. The story goes in these episodes that Sisko, Dr. Bashir, and Dax are transported back in time to San Francisco of 2024. And Sisko and Bashir find themselves in a sanctuary zone in San Francisco. The story goes that the United States in 2024, in the Star Trek universe, is a place racked by enormous economic inequality, political instability. And so one way to deal with all the massive problems was to create sanctuary zones in every major city in the United States. Sanctuary zones then become these places for warehousing unhoused, unemployed, essentially the leftovers of the economy. And they're barricaded in these concentration camps in all major cities. And so San Francisco is the one in which is the setting for these two episodes. Ira Behr, and talking about this, the showrunner for Deep Space Nine, talked about how he was inspired by a lot of the stuff that was going on at the time in Los Angeles and discussion. This is sort of in the early to middle 1990s, that there was discussion about creating camps for homeless folk around that time, and it inspired him to think about this idea of these sanctuary zones. But the story continues to the point where there's a major uprising from the San Francisco sanctuary zone that comes to be known in Star Trek lore as the Bell Riots. And they take place in late August 2024. I wanted to talk with Will Burrows because so much of his art has been inspired by Deep Space Nine, and in particular, the Bell Riots. And so I wanted to talk about what this momentous moment in Star Trek lore and history, why this was something that inspired his work, and how he came to think about blending his work with the Star Trek universe. So my guest today is artist Will Burrows. Will, thank you so much for talking with me. I really, really appreciate you being here. I've been a big fan of yours for a long time, and I've talked about you before on the program. I've talked with you both with David Seitz, who has used one of your posters on the cover of his book, and also you have a big fan in Una McCormick, the noted Star Trek novelist. We've talked about how fantastic your work and vision is. So I just want to say I'm really, really grateful to talk with you and to hear a little bit more about your vision. So welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here and excited to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no, I really want to get just right into this and sort of to talk about how you sort of blended this. So first, whenever I talk with Star Trek folk, I always ask them a little bit about their ideas of their sort of exposure to Star Trek. So your work as an artist really is interesting because it uses sort of pop kind of comic type art with a really sort of poignant political awareness. I wanted to ask first, though, how did you get first interested in Star Trek? How did you become a Trekkie?
Well, I used to watch The Next Generation with my dad as a kid during its original run, but it wasn't until toward the end of that time that I really got into it. And I don't know for sure now what triggered that. Um, the end of The Next Generation also coincided with the beginning of Deep Space Nine. I think that probably had something to do with it. Um, but I always considered The Next Generation my favorite Trek series until I sorry about that. Until I rewatched Deep Space Nine a few years ago, and there were some episodes I had never even seen before. There was a lot I had missed about Deep Space Nine uh, the first time through, um, but now I would absolutely say Deep Space Nine is my favorite series.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so many stories that I've talked to with people whose work in various sort of ways is inspired by Star Trek. Always have these stories of sitting down with some parent or another, and that was their sort of formative exposure, was sitting down with a parent or a loved one who brought them into the universe. Um, Thinking about Star Trek, like what was it that spoke to you about Star Trek? Why did you enjoy it, and why did you keep pursuing watching it?
Well, I think uh, particularly at that age, I was well, 1993. I was 9 years old. Um, I was beginning to be aware that I didn't quite fit in, and I think Star Trek helped me feel okay with that. Given how many of the heroes are um, misfits of some form or another, often one of a kind, like the only Vulcan, half Vulcan on a ship full of humans, or the only Klingon, the only android, the only Ferengi in Starfleet. Um, and I think Star Trek, uh, as I was, going through adolescence, um, did inform my values a lot. I I appreciate um, on the one hand, a very serious ethical dilemma Star Trek. That's classic part of what Star Trek is. I think infused throughout Star Trek, the central message uh, is that humanity advances most through cooperation rather than competition. But it's also like uh, mixed together with campy space adventures and um, sort of uh, gratuitous but PG rated horniness. Um,
It's,
so,
yeah, I mean, I wanted to sort of pick at this question because, I mean, it ties into your sort of work, that sort of aspect of it. You mentioned that DS9 has become sort of one of your famous or your most beloved series. What is it about that series that sort of ties into your interest in campy science fiction, serious sort of moral dilemma discussions, and the sort of PG rated horniness? Why does DS9 sort of fit your bill for these things?
well, it's funny because you may remember during the original run, people weren't happy with Deep Space Nine. Uh, and one of the things that a lot of people said was that it was like a soap opera because they were stuck on this station. They weren't doing much exploration. Um, and I think as I watch it again now, those same aspects of the show are what makes it age so well for me. Um, that is, I really love almost all of the main characters, uh, and the villains are great villains to hate. Um, and even the characters I don't necessarily like as much, I like their relationship with other characters. I think about Bashir in particular. Um, like he's a bit of a sex pest sometimes, but on the other hand, his relationships with Garrick and with O'Brien are really rich and interesting. Um, Almost all of the characters on that show go through some significant development over the course of the 7 seasons. Um, and also, being on the station, they're tied to Bajor and its situation and its politics. And so, because of that, Deep Space Nine was able to, I think, spend more time looking at how that utopian future doesn't just exist and you can't just take it for granted. You have to fight for it and you have to maintain it.
Yeah, it does provide that sort of rich setting, and the characterization. I always tell people that I think that the character arcs of so many of the folk in DS9 is probably the richest you'll find in the Star Trek universe, and particularly right with something like Bashir, who was really quite difficult to sort of like at the beginning. He's just really sort of grating, but you come to that's the thing. You get to be able to spend some time and understand so many people's backstories in such a way that you come to see them as like sort of real human beings, including the villains, as you say, right? You get to
Right.
sort of, and especially, Ducat, Bill Ducat, right? I mean, the analog of anything. If there's a space Hitler in Star Trek, right? It's Ducat, but there are moments in which you can really resonate with him emotionally and understand where he's coming from, at least. That's very, very rich. So there's not sort of one dimensional good or evil in the series, which a lot of people sort of want out of science fiction. I know that there's a lot of discussions in the Star Wars universe about depictions of good and evil that way. They want something very simple, but Star Trek never really gives into that. Um, I want to get closer to talking about your art because I could talk with you about Star Trek for a long time. But uh, one of the really cool things about your work as an artist is that you blend your political consciousness with your love of science fiction. So we talked a little bit about your love of science fiction. How did you get into art?
Um, it was just something that was always there. Uh, my parents were both making art,
Hmm.
encouraged me to be creative. Um, so it was not something that I pursued in terms of my education, but it was something I always did because I loved it and it was sort of a compulsion to be uh, spending time doing some kind of art. And well, honestly, some of my old art from when I was a kid, I found not too long ago a drawing I did, must have been 10 years old or so, of Quark with a batleth.
So you were doing Star Trek for a long time then.
Yeah. Well, so um, that's part of the answer to your question is, um, 'cause it was a huge part of my childhood, and from about age 9 into high school, it was like I was obsessively a Trekkie.
Mm.
Um, but it gradually waned over my teenage years. I watched Deep Space Nine and Voyager all through their original runs, but after that, I didn't really keep up with Star Trek for a long time. And my way back into Star Trek was being on um, lefty parts of the internet and just
Mm.
seeing how often people were talking about Star Trek because it was something that they loved. Uh, and I think particularly Deep Space Nine, and a lot of people have been rediscovering Deep Space Nine, um, and it has aged particularly well.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, in terms of your work is um, kind of in the style of agitprop, right? It's um, in a comic style, but you're often referencing the kinds of queer themes or the sort of anti-settler kind of sentiments uh, found in sort of lefty political space nowadays. Um, how did you decide that you wanted to express political themes through your art and specifically through Star Trek? You talked a little bit about how DS9, the setting of that just sort of lends itself to that, but why did you decide not only I want to do Star Trek, but I also want to do Star Trek politically?
Yeah, well, that took me some time to figure out actually. The first design I did was the Friend of Garrick, and that is still the most popular of any of the designs I've done. Um, and I when that it was more popular than I anticipated, and I wanted to follow it up with something, and I really had no idea at first how to follow it up. And the first piece of um, Star Trek art I made after that was um, a drawing of Cisco in the style of like an Eastern Orthodox icon, um, but he was holding the glass from in the pale moonlight when he's talking about his moral conflict, and it said on it, "It's easy to be a saint in paradise," uh, which is a favorite line from Deep Space Nine. Um, but that was never a very popular design. Um, I did a pin that said "Friend of Dorothy" with Dorothy's Bornak from the Golden Girls. Um, I did a design with Moogie from Deep Space Nine as Rosie the Riveter, and it said "The future is female." Um, but it was shortly after that that I started doing explicitly anti-fascist and pro-union work, and found that that was sort of my niche, and that was something that uh, people were very interested in and wasn't really being provided anywhere else. I mean, obviously not in the official merch, but even other um, fan merch producers uh, don't seem to be doing a lot of political work, um, and there is a demand for it. So
Yeah,
I've
I
started
wondered
doing
about that.
that.
So, for I have some of your famous print based on the old Union poster of the boss doesn't need you. That was one of I think the very first things I bought from your store. I also have like several of your uh, anti-fascist Star Trek deltas, right? The insignias. I often wear that to class when I'm teaching, and people are always really interested because they were like, that's not a standard Star Trek badge," and I'm like, "No," and it raises all these sorts of questions, right? Because you have the three iron arrows, right? The anti-fascist symbol. Um, and a lot of this stuff sort of came out, what, in the last, say, 5 years or so?
Well, which
The badges and
oh,
the
so yeah,
union poster?
I've been doing this for about 3.5 years now.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. Why do you think that they became so popular all of a sudden that way? Why did you think that that was the uptick for your work?
Well, uh, I'm not very sure. I think um, there are. So I think what a lot of my work does is sort of relies on being in on a joke, um, and it puts two things together that you're maybe not accustomed to seeing together. Um, and so when you meet somebody who gets the joke, there's a moment of connection. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
like um, I was wearing my Friend of Garrick T-shirt one time in a small town Walmart, and one of the employees got really excited, came to talk to me and show me a tattoo he has of his son's name in Klingon. Uh,
Could you explain the friend of Garrick and what the inside joke is for
Sure.
folks who
Yeah.
may not have seen or heard your work or not understand? Like there's a whole sort of level of jokes involved in that.
Yeah. So, as I was getting back into Star Trek, a friend of mine introduced me to a couple of Trek groups on Facebook. One of them in particular was centered around Garrick and the idea that Garrick was queer, which is, it turns out, um, also the thought of Andrew Robinson, who played Garrick. Um, he he has said in interviews that he decided his character's motivation uh, was that he wanted to have sex with Bashir, um, and so that was always the subtext, um, but never the text. And um, so in this group, somebody, I don't know who originated the joke, but Friend of Garrick was a Trekkie adaptation of Friend of Dorothy, which some people may be familiar, um, was a sort of old timey euphemism for a gay man or a queer person in general. Dorothy being the main character in The Wizard of Oz. Um,
Yeah,
and
no, it's a fabulous piece. Can you describe a little bit about what how it's represented?
so in Garrick's first appearance on DS9, he meets the Klingon sisters, Lursa and Betor, and during part of that scene, he kind of makes jazz hands, uh, and that screen caps of that have been the source of many memes. Um, and one day I just had the idea. It was revealed to me from heaven, and angels sang. No, what actually happened was I don't know the original context, but there's another image from SpongeBob where he has his hands in sort of a similar position, and there's a rainbow, and uh, they just sort of overlaid themselves in my mind. And what if I did Garrick with his hands like this, and a rainbow, and front of Garrick? And so I drew it up and I shared it with the group, um, and people were really interested in stickers and pins and patches. And I hadn't even thought of doing T-shirts, but a lot of people wanted T-shirts, and there was a member of the group who worked at a screen printing shop in Dallas. Um, so they've been printing my shirts ever since.
That's great. Yeah, no, it is. I think that is probably one of the first images that I came across of your work. Um, but most recently, to tie it into our my intro, and part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you now, right, timely, because we're now speaking right towards the end of August 2024. uh this is Bell Riots time. So one of your work in the past couple of years at least has been sort of highlighting that, with some bumper stickers and some t-shirts that I know that have been selling out quite a bit. uh Following you on social media, I see that like the Bell Riot stuff is really selling well at this time. So I was wondering, like, why did you decide to uh, focus on celebrating the Bell riots? Talk a little bit about why that inspired you, and why do you think that that's something that people are sort of, why is it resonating with people now?
Yeah, well, I think in broad strokes, a lot of what the Bell riots represent is familiar. Um, that we do live in a tumultuous time. Um, we have extreme wealth inequality, and it does, I think, for a lot of people, feel like we're at a sort of turning point, at least in the U.S. and maybe other places as well, um, where we could potentially go be set on very different trajectories. Um, and so in broad strokes, I, the way I understand it is a meme for people who would like to see that sort of transformative change. Um, there are a lot of takes on the Bell Riots that read it as a prediction, and I understand the impulse to do that, but um, on the one hand, it feels I've never really been part of arriving at a Star Trek time before. Like I, the original series had the uh, the eugenics wars in the '90s, um, and so I was a Trek fan at that time, but I was just getting on the internet and I didn't have contact with other Trekkies. Um, so it feels a bit like stories of um, 19th century rapture cults that would go to a particular place expecting Jesus to return. Um, I know like nobody actually thinks of it that way, but it feels a little bit like that. Um, and I think what bothers me the most about treating it as a prediction is that um, what they imagined 30 years ago was a commentary on what they were seeing 30 years ago. And what they imagined was genuinely dystopian. It was overcrowded, um, totally inadequate to meet the need that was there. But in many ways, what we actually have now in actual 2024 is worse than what they imagined in those two episodes.
Yeah, I mean, for context for people who aren't necessarily Trekkies but are listening in, right? The sanctuary zones are created, and they essentially sort of cordoned off a variety of city blocks and let people sort of go wild. They create the inhabitants create their own sort of social structures, but people are living there in a variety of ways, and there's some kind of a welfare system that provides inadequate benefits to people. But the story goes, right, is that there's an uprising led by the Star Trek crew for a variety of different story purposes. But the purpose of the what's interesting about the story is that it's a violent uprising, and the lore goes that it changes the attitude of the United States to the income inequality that's going on in the country. That it's a moment of reckoning in some sense that really raises people's awareness about how deep the problems were, and that apparently it changes people's minds in such a way that eventually leads to the kind of thinking that establishes the Federation, you know, 200 years or so in the futures. But it's a key moment of supposedly political consciousness in the United States that if it had not happened, the Federation could not have taken place. Um, so that's the sort of importance of this Bell Riots idea in the lore. And so it's interesting, as you point out, right? A lot of people are sort of like reflecting on the situation in the world today in the United States, particularly the levels of unhoused people that we see in almost all major cities, but particularly here and where I am on the West Coast. There's constant discussion of that in Portland, San Diego, Los Angeles, Seattle. Um, and it does seem as though people, I see the chatter online that sort of people are kind of looking for signs in ways in which maybe the Bell riots could take place. In fact, I've been seeing all this discussion about whether or not these far right neo-Nazi protests in the UK are indications of the Bell riots breaking out, or that armed uprising is which seems totally. I'm not sure why people are making those connections. Those are anti-immigrant far right. Has very little to do with the kind of stuff that's talked about in the Bell riots, at least. But it does seem that your work seems to speak to a kind of impulse in the world today, particularly amongst lefties, that want some kind of moment to happen that will bring a better future. And your work seems to speak to that impulse. Do you have a hope by focusing on the Bell riots in any kind of way? Is there a reason that you
Well,
decided that you wanted to talk about this of all the sort of Star Trek stuff in your work? Why did you decide that this was a thing that you wanted to hit on?
I mean, part of it was just that I noticed that 2024 was a presidential election year in the US. And so the idea of presenting that as if it were a presidential campaign logo came together in my mind. Um, but in a deeper sense, like the hope I have for a lot of my work um, is that it would contribute to um, uh, normalizing uh, and promotion of progressive politics among Trekkies.
Yeah, that seems clear. I mean, part of the other aspect, we talked a little bit about this with your friends of Garrick. Big, strong sort of work, emphasis in your work, not only with Garrick, but also some of your work in which you portray Jadzia, Dax,
Mhm.
right? You use your work in some sense to hint at, to play with, to express queer pride. Um, I was wondering why you decided that this was somewhere that you wanted to go in with your art as well. Why was that an important part of your sort of political consciousness that you needed to embody in your work?
Um, I think Star Trek for so many people who are queer or neurodivergent or otherwise understood themselves uh, as different, Star Trek was a sort of haven, um, and so it's been important to me to honor that with the kind of designs I do.
Have you gotten any feedback from people about the work that you do that way, the focusing on pride from fans
Um,
of yours?
well, I mean, yes, a number of people have thanked me for doing that. I actually am very lucky. It was a customer who was in Finland um, got to interview Andrew Robinson wearing one of my very earliest shirts, and so I have a screen cap of when he saw that for the first time, and that is one of the coolest things that has happened in the process of doing this. Um, there was another customer who told me about wearing the shirt to meet Terry Farrell at a convention um, and explaining to her what Dax meant to them as a trans person. And from what I understood, that may have been new to her, but she appreciated it. Uh, so that's been a really cool thing.
That's very cool. That's very cool. Um, do you know of any other sort of Star Trek celebrities that have encountered your work?
Oh yeah, I mean a few people have purchased from me, um, and uh, so that pro union poster that you have
Yeah.
um, during the WGA SAG-AFTRA strike, both Robert Hewitt Wolf, who co-wrote the episode, and Chase Masterson, who co-starred in the episode, they both carried that poster in the strike.
Wow. That's very cool. I hadn't seen that. I'll have to go look that up online now. That's very, very cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have some pictures on my social media from that. They're a bit farther back now, but yeah.
I'll go take a look at that. Yeah, something I wanted to think about that with you is that um, I mentioned that your work was on the cover of David Seiss's um, recent book, and we did an interview with him earlier this year. Um, how did he approach you to
He
use your
did,
work?
yeah. Yeah.
I see. I see. Have you gotten any other sort of queries or inquiries to use your work in that kind of way?
Not really, no. That's been the only one.
Yeah. No, it's a great cover. I mean, I remember when I first saw that, I was like, "This is like it's a perfect pairing of his great book and your art together is just really masterful." I thought, and so I was really excited when I interviewed him to talk a little bit about possibly having a chance to talk with you. I want to ask where, I mean, so you've been working at this for a few years now, and really made a hit with some of the ways in which this kind of chimes with a political consciousness at this time. Where do you see your art going from here? Well, what would you like to be able to do with your work in general? And do you have any sort of plans for more Star Trek themed work with a political consciousness?
I do, yeah. And it's been a long time since I've done any new designs. There's a couple of reasons for that, but I have ideas for several that I'm looking forward to um, getting finished and available, um, with varying degrees of political consciousness. I have one that makes reference to the idea that Seven of Nine is a sort of autistic icon. Um, Another one that makes reference to so Star Trek Five is idiosyncratically probably my favorite of the movies. Um, and so yeah, I have a plan for a design that makes reference to their attacking and dethroning God. Uh,
Wow,
um, and
that's a really sort of iconoclastic sort of appreciation. A lot of people think that that's one of the worst. Why does that film speak to you? That's interesting.
um, I think what I like the best about it is the way it develops the relationship between Kirk, Spock, and Bones. Um, I I love the camping scenes in particular, and um, then at the end, Kirk goes to hug Spock, and he says, "Please, Captain, not in front of the Klingons." Uh, I just love that part. I don't know. It's campy, but it's genuinely enjoyable.
So, a couple of new designs. Are you planning on expanding your reach of merchandise, or
I
how you
do.
view your sales?
I have some ideas for other than Star Trek designs, and I have plans also trying to expand my skills into areas beyond what I've been doing. Um, so I'll have some exciting things coming in the future.
How soon can we anticipate looking at some of this stuff?
Oh,
Within the next year?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. I look forward to those kinds of designs. I mean, one thing that just I wanted to sort of, as we start to wrap up and think about this, um, most of your work is focused on Star Trek. Not all of it, but a big chunk of it. Um, are there any sort of plans to sort of incorporate any other science fiction universes in your work?
Um, Not immediately. S- uh, Star Trek is always the one that I've been tied the closest to. Um, I've enjoyed other science fiction, but it's never. Um, I've never gone as deep into anything else
Mm.
as Star Trek. Um, that could be fun, but I don't immediately have plans to.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of your brand, so that makes a lot of sense. Are there other science fiction universes that speak to you in any kind of way that you've
I mean,
enjoyed? Maybe not as much, but do sort of are notable for you?
so Star Wars, I think, wins on having weird little guys. They had the budget for generally cooler aliens than Star Trek did. Star Trek certainly had some cool aliens, but um, like Star Wars had uh, Jim Henson puppets and all sorts of things. Um, so yeah, that's something that stands out. Yeah.
Do you do commissions?
Um, Not I have not heretofore.
Yeah,
I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I
yeah.
don't. I'm not in the practice of doing it.
Is art your sort of main day job, or is
It
this?
is now, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. That's great. That's great that you've been able to sort of work that way into it. Um, and I guess just sort of to end up in this way, um, since you're such a fan of the series, um, what new Star Trek do you like of the new series that we've seen in the past, say, 10 years or so? Discovery is finally finished,
yeah.
its run, but we have a bunch of other stuff. Do you enjoy the new Star Trek?
I do. I do enjoy it. It doesn't hold the same space for me that '90s Trek does, and I
Mm,
think mostly that's just because of the resonance from my childhood. Um,
yeah,
my biggest criticism of the newer treks is that the seasons are so short. They don't have enough time to develop the characters like they used to. Um, so that's been but my biggest uh, disappointment is I generally like it, but there's not enough of it.
yeah,
Uh, but among the newer series, I do have an affinity for Lower Decks, particularly um, because the Next Generation and Voyager have had the chance to revisit some of their storylines, and there are things that happen at the end of Deep Space Nine, like Martok goes to be Chancellor of the Klingon Empire,
yeah.
Nog goes to be Grand Nagus, and so Lower Decks is the only series that has really revisited those stories at all. We still don't know anything about the Klingon Empire under Martok, but we did get to see Nog as Grand Nagus.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I've noticed that, and what's interesting about that is I don't know. Lower Decks has is a comedy, but at least with the past couple of seasons has really started to express some much sort of darker themes that are much more akin to DS9 in a way that are surprising.
Yeah,
Is given the medium, and you're right, it's tying into the after effects of the Dominion War in ways that are really quite emotionally resonant, right, in Lower Decks. What's interesting too, I just finished watching second season of Prodigy, which I found like some of the best storytelling. I think, I don't know if you've had a chance to sort of see
yeah,
it. I was really blown away by that second season. I thought that the story telling in that was just really, really quite amazing. But some part of it is exciting as you get to it's sort of a continuation of Voyager in a lot of ways, right?
right. Yeah,
Um, so these two are sort of taking off and extending the universe in really exciting ways, tying into some of the new stuff like Picard, um, which is really fascinating. So it's just adding to the universe in really rich ways. Do you plan to do any of your art using themes from the new Star Trek?
I do have an idea. I've had an idea kicking around for some time and never been quite sure how to execute it. But I want to do something with Seven and Raffi from
Ah, yeah,
Picard.
yeah, yeah. That would seem to fit your brand too. So.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, Will, I really want to thank you for spending some time with me, just briefly to talk about your work and to explore sort of like the origins of your thinking about some of this and where you think you're going with it. And I appreciate you sort of talking Star Trek with me. I really, part of our work is always trying to figure out like how do these stories help us to think about political awareness and issues and consciousness in a radical kind of lefty sense. And what I've always really appreciated with your work is the way in which you're able to encompass really sort of complex kind of political issues with a humorous bent and using the Star Trek iconography. I think the work that you do really, really sort of just expands like the radical imagination that we have in the world today. So I just want to say thank you for your work and thank you for your time for being here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your having me on.
Yeah. And thank you all for listening in and paying some attention to us. You can follow the Anarres project on social media. We're all over the place. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Threads, we're on Mastodon, we're on Blue Sky. We're all over the place. Just put in Anarres project. You can find us. You can also find our podcast, our audio podcast on Spotify. And you can see our video footage of our interviews on YouTube. Thank you so much, Will. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we can talk again sometime.
Thank you.